I am going to share with you a bit about Kundalini awakening. I am going to define them simply and clearly without the jargon that's pretty typical when talking about something as complex as consciousness or spiritual awakening. And so hopefully by the end of this, you will have a good understanding of what Kundalini is, what Kundalini awakenings are like. And at the end, I will talk a little bit about why I feel like there is so much misinformation or disinformation regarding Kundalini and Kundalini awakenings. So in very simple, clear terms, what is Kundalini? It is consciousness. And so the best description I have ever heard for what a Kundalini awakening is that it is the forced flow of consciousness. And so what a lot of people don't recognize is that there are a lot of different kinds of spiritual awakening out there. And so I find that this is actually one of the biggest reasons for misinformation out there is that people don't recognize that there are many different kinds of spiritual awakening, um, and that they all can have different symptoms or signs associated with them. If you're interested in all of those different sorts of awakenings, you can look at my book, The Spiritual Awakening Guide, that goes over many of them. But if we were to bring it back to Kundalini awakenings, I find that a lot of times people confuse what may be the preparatory stages of Kundalini awakening for a Kundalini awakening itself, or maybe going through some other type of spiritual awakening that is intense, all in its own regard. But it may be something like a top-down awakening in which the energy channels in the head are awake and kind of opened, but there's no energy flowing through the body. And so where is Kundalini? Kundalini is like a ball of potential energy that is held within the sacrum. And so all of us have this potential energy within us. It's just for some of us, it gets activated. And to be even more confusing, for some of us, it gets activated for a little bit or for a moment. For some of us, it doesn't get activated at all. And for some of us, we might go through a full awakening. I've always loved anatomy, and one of the things that I found when I was studying the physical structures of the body, and I am by far not the first to notice this, but that the curves of the spine and the structure of the body supports the chakras and supports the energy potential that we are going to call Kundalini. So if I were to talk about this, simply I will say that every place that you have a chakra in your body, there is going to be a curve or curvature of the spine. In the case of the latent reservoir of Kundalini, our sacrum forms a sort of cup. So it's the triangle bone at the end of your spine. It is convex on one side, on the back, it is concave on the other side, going towards the pelvis. And so within this cup of the sacrum lies Kundalini energy. And so Kundalini awakening can be very much termed a bottom-up awakening of energy rather than a top-down awakening of energy, which is actually much more common in our culture. And so what happens when this energy awakens? This can be divided into a couple of different categories. The first is Kundalini stirring. This is a temporary experience of the energy rising. Typically, somebody will feel a bit of heat or something rising up their back momentarily. And maybe they will get some signs like, having a realization, or maybe their body will move into a certain posture, or their hands will go into certain positions. But for a lot of people, the stirring just feels like a bit of shaking in the body, typically a bit of heat rising, and it's very momentary. And what is significant, what differentiates the stirring from other types of Kundalini awakening, is that it is temporary. And somebody while undergoing a Kundalini stirring um, will be able to function during that stirring. And so this is a temporary experience of that Kundalini energy. A Kundalini experience is a more powerful rising of that energy. Instead of a small stream coming up or like a gentle thermometer rising, this is a powerful stream of energy. A lot of time people will use words like explosion, freight train, like a huge tap water going through their body, volcano exploding. There is no denying this type of experience. And again, people will feel this energy rising and flowing through their midline, and it will feel like that freight train. And people cannot function while they're having this experience. And so during this experience, somebody may be in an ecstatic state. They may be doing things like whole body postures or shaking, or they may be completely rigid and unable to communicate. The clearest examples that we can find of this are people who receive Shakti, people who receive energy transmissions from somebody else whose Kundalini is awakened. So having a specific transmission from that teacher can create that Kundalini experience in the follower or in the person present. And so this is, again, another temporary experience of the energy. For most people, it will last like a couple minutes. Um, that's, for some people, it may last half an hour or something. I think that the longest person I've worked with who's been going through a Kundalini experience with that degree of severity was for about 2 months. And so what is confusing about talking about this is that somebody who is going through a full Kundalini awakening that I'm going to talk about next may have many Kundalini experiences. And so a full Kundalini awakening is a permanent rising of the energy. So somebody may have Kundalini experiences when they're having a full Kundalini awakening, a permanent Kundalini awakening. But that permanent or full Kundalini awakening is somebody for whom the energy has risen, that potential has released from the sacrum, has gone up the midline, and is trying to work its way through the chakra system. So let's take a step back for a moment, because I mentioned that one of the sources of misinformation is that commonly people think that the preparatory stages or different kinds of spiritual awakening are Kundalini awakening. On some abstract level, that is sort of true because everything is consciousness, on a certain perspective from a certain level. But sometimes people will report, oh, I have spiritual interests. Oh, I've been meditating for a bit. Oh, I've taken this course with this person who's promised that my Kundalini is going to awaken. And so I must be having a Kundalini awakening. Often what is happening with people is that they are mistaking the surface level energies of the body opening up. So we can talk about those as the chi levels of the body, or the energies, the flows that go through the energy meridians of the body, like in acupuncture and other associated healing methods, with the deeper energies of the body. In Chinese medicine, and you don't need to remember this, but We talk about it as the energies that are deeper in the body go through what are known as the extraordinary meridians. And they are more associated with essence, with the soul, with ancestral energies, with kind of like the deep stuff of the body. And the meridians that we need to really pay attention to that are extraordinary, that are really affected by a Kundalini awakening are the Du and Ren. So basically the front midline and the back midline. And so a lot of people start feeling some energy flow, maybe through their arms or hands. Maybe they're doing yoga or Tai Chi, or awakening in other ways. And so they may feel some electric currents, which is what chi feels like. And chi or prana in the body very much feels like electric currents. It feels like a bit of flow. And most significantly, it will often be in the hands or legs or other areas of the body rather than the midline of the body. With that reservoir of energy in the sacrum, that is Kundalini, that is latent Kundalini. Um, and without the midline of the body, without that extraordinary meridians being cleared, it is not a Kundalini awakening. It is something that may be quite extraordinary or might be preparing somebody for a Kundalini awakening, but it is not a Kundalini awakening, at least not yet. And so I will say, with kind of the preparatory energies of the body, feeling that chi in the body, feeling energy flowing through the body, that is really wonderful. Being able to do all sorts of healing work, you're able to do all sorts of healing work and other work with that, and it can awaken you in a really gradual, lovely way. It is a wonderful way to get your body and mind in line for just in general health of mind, body, and spirit. Um, because the chi or the preparatory energies of the body very much have to do with the physical world, with our physical bodies, with our daily lives here. And so having this energy awaken typically awakens people to be more interested in the earth, in nature, in how their physical bodies are doing. Maybe they'll take up an exercise routine or be interested in their nutrition and lifestyle and how it's impacting them, what's going on in the world, socially, economically, politically. There may be all sorts of interests there when there wasn't before, because of the awakening of kind of the physical energies of the body awakens us to the physical energies of the world as well. But in terms of the Kundalini awakening, a lot of people refer to it as a snake. That's kind of how it's come about in Western consciousness, is that in its potential state, all in the sacrum, it is curled up like a snake. And so you'll not only see this in Western consciousness, if you've ever, looked at some Egyptian paintings and you've seen the pictures of like the snakes coming out of the third eye and, the snakes coming out of the crown and stuff like that, that is Kundalini. I will likely do some follow-up videos to this because it's a big topic, but Kundalini is just a word that has come across for the specific energy that has been popularized in, Western mindsets. There are all sorts of cultures and traditions that talk about this energy, usually utilizing different names or talking about it in slightly different ways, but it's still kind of the same energy. And so I do love the concept of the snake, and a lot of people will get images of that because it is something that is easy to understand in Western consciousness, and we kind of associate it with awakening, with the Bible and that sort of stuff. And that is why some very Christian fundamentalists would be like, Kundalini is evil, it is demonic, and it isn't. It is just consciousness. One of the other definitions I love for it is curl. That is the original understanding of it when I first started studying Kashmir Shaivism. Um, the notion of it being a curl curled up 3.5 times in the sacrum. And what happens is that during a full awakening is that it starts unwinding and working its way through and up the midline. Um, was really helpful for me at the time, but I have also found the snake imagery helpful. And so the trajectory of Kundalini is that uncurling in a permanent awakening is that uncurling of the snake, uncurling of the curl, and it going up the midline. And typically what will happen is that it will run across blockage and it will stop. And so in simplicity, talking about the chakras. Our chakras are storehouses of information, and we have so much stored up information. Talk about this in my spiritual awakening guide, but for simplicity, I will say that um, we've had a lot of trauma, we've had a lot of conditioning, we have a lot of ancestral patterns, we have a lot of conditioning coming from belief systems, from religions, from schools and organizations that all tell us, who we are, that have all on some level um, created blockages in our system because we have learned to shield ourselves, to shut ourselves down, to close ourselves off, to repress our emotions. And all of those go into our body, they go into our chakras, and they are stored there until we start to deal with them. And so the good and bad part about Kundalini awakening with that forced flow of consciousness is that it forces up all of this trauma, all of this baggage, everything that is heavy and not light, everything that is not consciousness within the body. It forces it to come up to arise. And this can be quite intense for people for quite a long period of time. This is one of the things that I do look for with Kundalini awakenings is that somebody isn't going to go through a Kundalini awakening in a week or 6 weeks or even 6 years. It is, and anybody who is telling you a particular trajectory or particular timeline is very misinformed about the process because although it is a lengthy process, if somebody is truly going through a full Kundalini awakening, um, promising somebody that it will be, it is a 5-year long process, and after that you are enlightened, that person is not understanding how psychologically, energetically, some of us may be in a state where we are, okay, I completely surrender and can release and work through and have the support to work through and the knowledge to work through and the ability to work through a huge amount of stuff as it's sort of pouring out of our system. And some of us have less support. Some of us have more personal healing to do. Some of us have more ancestral healing to do. Some of us may have been dealt a whopper by what religion we were born into. And so all of these things can mean that as Kundalini is rising, as that consciousness is rising and is forcing out anything that is not pure consciousness, pure awareness, um, that different stages of the path are going to be more difficult or easier for certain people. If we were to go back to the preparatory energies of the body, I will say that ideally, a lot of us would have, that 10, 20-year experience in therapy and yoga and Tai Chi and, all of these sorts of things to prime our bodies and our minds and our spirits, as well as the knowledge to understand what we are going through and be able to navigate it a bit better. A lot of us in the modern world, we do not have that preparatory time. We are sort of plunged into the deep part of the ocean, and our bodies not only have to attempt to awaken the other meridians of the body, but also deal with this huge amount of energy flowing through the midline of the body, attempting to clear or purify the body. So Kundalini awakening has a couple of phases. I'm going to talk about it in terms of elements or energetics first. For most people starting out, Kundalini energy feels like, and this is known as the purification fire. And this fire goes up the midline. And again, somebody might have a Kundalini experience where that sort of blows off the top of their head and a whole bunch of stuff releases at once. Or it may be kind of a milder, smoldering fire that's going on. And the reason for that fire, the purpose of that fire is to burn away anything that is not consciousness. So all of that stuff that I've talked about, trauma, conditioning, belief systems that we hold on to, aspects of our identity, it burns all of this stuff away. And so for quite a long time for people, they will feel either bursts of fire or the energy of fire working through certain parts of their system. For example, when I'm talking about the chakras, I'm not talking about just the midline. When we are talking about, for example, the solar plexus chakra, um, that chakra is not just in the center of the body. The chakra energetically has to do with everything that is in that region of the body. So it is clearing away, if it is at that level, it is clearing away not only the stuff in the third chakra, but the stuff having to do with the lower rib cage, all of the organs there, liver, gallbladder, stomach, pancreas, part of the intestines. And everything, the diaphragm where we breathe into and breathe out of, lower part of the lungs, all of the tissues and muscles that are there. Somebody who is having a Kundalini awakening will feel this. They will feel the stuckness there. They will feel Kundalini attempting to work through that area. In some areas of our body, Kundalini can work through, that fire can kind of burn through easily. And in some areas of our body, it might be like, in my first book, I talk about the concept of boulders in a river, sometimes just to mix metaphors a little bit, even though I'm talking about fire. In some areas of the body, that Kundalini energy might have to go through, some small rocks. In other areas, it might have to attempt to sort of smack against a huge boulder, and it will take some time to do so. And so Kundalini will work its way up the body. That curl or snake will unfold and work its way up the body. And what will happen is that the energies that are stuck in that chakra will burn away, they will clear, uh, they will release. And what happens when they do so is that how we look at ourselves, how we look at the world, how we look at other people will change. This is something to very much look for if you're going through Kundalini awakening. Sometimes people very much focus on all of the symptoms, like feeling shaking. Well, somebody can experience shaking when they're kind of in that fight, flight, or freeze state. That doesn't mean that they're having a Kundalini awakening. It means that they're having a trauma response. Or, people for varying reasons, for identity reasons, might, fake going into yoga positions, or hear that's what Kundalini awakening is about, and for their own purposes start to kind of do some of those behaviors. We are complex beings and have complex reasons for being and doing what we do. But the one thing that we cannot shake or fake is that our perspective greatly changes. Who we believe ourselves to be greatly changes. And when this consciousness is flowing through our body more clearly, how we look at the world, at ourselves changes, and the amount of suffering that we experience decreases. And so people can fake all sorts of things. They can say, oh, I don't have an ego, I'm enlightened, or, whatever they want to say. But I will say two things. The first is that if somebody is not awakening through the body, they will still not cure or heal the root cause of their suffering. And so mentally, they may think all sorts of things about themselves, but the suffering will still be playing out in their lives. They will still be going through the same sort of stuck patterns that they always have. And I will do a video on this if people are interested, but there are particular perspective shifts that happen when the baseline of our energy truly works its way through a chakra. For example, in the first chakra, that is a place where we feel like we are the center of the world, like we most times like we're the ultimate victim. We're not able to really see anybody else except through the prism of our own pain and our own thoughts. And so one of the things I talk about in my work quite a bit is that one of the ways that you can tell if somebody is basically conscious is that they have worked through what I call the superiority inferiority loop. And that happens if Kundalini has risen, the baseline of it has risen up to the third chakra. And that is basically somebody needing to feel like they're superior to you, like they're superior to their own humanity, or that they are inferior to you, because the first three chakras are very much about our own stuff, as well as a lot of ancestral and, patterns and that sort of stuff as well. But when I'm talking about that, a lot of you may recognize a few things. The first is that Kundalini can rise and fall again. And what is important is where the baseline of our energy is. We may have had all sorts of bursts of energy, all sorts of Kundalini stirrings, even a explosion of above the head or anything like that. But Kundalini energy, the baseline of it may still be locked in the first chakra. This is, in fact, extraordinarily common. And what I have to say is going to be very, very unpopular. So get ready for it. And that unpopular thought is that I would say 97% of people out there who are authentically experiencing a Kundalini awakening, that Kundalini has awakened a bit in their first chakra, but that baseline hasn't really changed. They're still in the first chakra perspective. And most commonly, this happens is because there are all sorts of spiritualities and spiritual paths that do not have to do with the body in this world. And until somebody truly faces their feelings, their emotions, what is going on in their body, instead of mentally sort of thinking about it or turning to teachers that are just mentally conceptualizing it instead of living it, the amount of suffering that somebody experiences, no matter what they're pretending, isn't going to change. How they look at themselves, how they look at the world, how they look at others isn't going to change. That superiority inferiority loop is still going to be present. And so one of the things that I commonly find with people who are in kind of that 97% is that largely they're having a top-down awakening where energies have awakened in the upper structures of the body, like the third eye and that sort of stuff. And they are having a bit of a Kundalini awakening as well, but largely they are so caught up in their top-down awakening and all of the energy that is stuck there, that things don't dynamically change for them. Things don't shift for them. And we can get into all sorts of complex thoughts and like maybe that is exactly where they're at. Maybe they're not ready to proceed forward. But unfortunately, I've worked with so many people over the last 20 years where they have gone through teachers and teachers, and a lot of them either haven't experienced Kundalini awakening for themselves. And so I kind of compare that to somebody trying to teach a plane how to be a pilot when they maybe perhaps have ridden on a plane, but they've never piloted a plane before, um, or they are going to somebody who maybe thinks that a Kundalini awakening is the preparatory energies of the body awakening, um, or is some sort of mental construct where they just have to tell themselves that they don't have an ego, or don't have a self, and that they'll be all good. And that doesn't work either. That doesn't reduce suffering. That doesn't shift Kundalini energies, and doesn't get somebody to the point where they are working with their Kundalini energy, their Kundalini awakening. Um, so I bring this up because I have worked with people that have been through so much hell. And in my own experiences, I certainly went through plenty of teachers and plenty of others who may have had sincerity, but who did not have the experience themselves, or who were like, oh, you're having a really severe experience, like really severe Kundalini awakening. And, many years later, I find out that my trajectory was, pretty common for people who are experiencing a Kundalini awakening, both in terms of severity and symptoms. But let's bring it back a little bit again. So when there's a lot of debate from people, and I always appreciate scholarly debate and stuff like that, but there is a bit of irony, because if you're somebody like me, or if you're anybody who has direct experience, discussing are the chakras real, isn't a way I want to spend my time, because yes, I know that they're real. I feel them, I experience them. I don't need to philosophically discuss them anymore. But a lot of people will kind of try to have this gotcha moment and be like, oh, Kundalini actually awakens through the second chakra, not the first chakra. Oh, you're wrong. And, all this sort of stuff. And so one of the things that is really helpful to understand is that there are different chakra systems. In the West, we utilize this 7 chakra system with the root or perineum, and then, second going all the way to 6th and 7th. But that is just kind of the standardized Western model. For example, there's the Taoist, 3 jiao system, um, which I like as well. But um, one of the things that I have experienced, in which I sense and work with in other people, is that the first and second chakra are kind of like a combined chakra. I do not experience it like separate chakras. Like, here is an energy in the first chakra, and here is your second chakra. Um, It's more like there is a big ball of that potential Kundalini energy in the sacrum. And when it releases, it can release through the first chakra, through the legs, so through the perineum. So energy is flowing downwards, which it eventually needs to do, or it can go upwards. So one of the questions that I get a lot about Kundalini energy is, isn't it sexual energy? And my answer to that is technically yes, that is one aspect of it. It is creation energy. So a lot of times what we do with creation energies is have sex or have children. That is quite literally the physical act of carrying out a creation energy. In some systems or understandings, the thought of Kundalini energy is that there is that of refined and unrefined sexual energies. And so the thought is that refined sexual energies, we can move them upwards through the body, specifically through the cerebrospinal matrix. So basically through the very inner part, through the CSF in our spinal cord, And then unrefined sexual energy, we can, release downward or release into our partner or whatever is going on. Um, I find thinking about that helpful because there is a lot that can be done with sexual energy, and it is certainly a part of consciousness. It is certainly a part of Kundalini energy. And the way that some people's Kundalini energies awaken is through things like sexual union. It is through things like big shifts in life. So menopause, childbirth, menstrual cycle for women, for men, they really can awaken through things like semen retention. However, I find like anything, people who tend to be a bit obsessed with that sort of stuff are tend to be pretty out of balance and are not doing their bodies really any favors. So just my personal take or thought on the process is that if they're just fixated on that one aspect of consciousness, there likely is a personal reason for that that maybe they should, be looking at. And so when Kundalini is first awakening, how it can move upwards is that it typically gets kind of pulsed by what we might consider the first chakra. So the perineum and basically the pelvic floor can kind of pulse it or contract. In some cases, people feel this as itching or heat. But the purpose of that is to basically like get Kundalini to come out of its potential state into rising into the body. And so when somebody is going through Kundalini awakening, I talked about the fire purification. And then people may go into the second phase where Kundalini feels more like that force flow that I'm talking about. So kind of like a stream, a river, an ocean, or kind of like, somebody has uncapped a fire hydrant and is just blasting everywhere, just depending. And so this energy is still kind of clearing the person out, but it is less about that fire purification and it is more about bringing consciousness to every channel and every area of our body. Think of the end goal of Kundalini awakening is for Kundalini, that flow of consciousness, to be in every channel, every organ, every tissue, every cell of our body. And so this is what this flow is that it is starting the process of bringing consciousness in a greater way, and it is still sort of like clearing out some of the gunk that has kind of remained behind. And so it's pretty typical for people to start feeling flow, and it can be pretty strong in people. They may also have intermittent periods of fire when something starts to open up. But if you conceptualize yourself as kind of a series of pipes, some of which may have a lot of gunk in them, some of which may be offline or haven't been used for a while, and this flow of Kundalini is attempting to flow through all of those pipes clearly and strongly, you'll sort of get what this second phase is about. And so people in this phase typically experience a pretty big shift in consciousness, um, and pretty big shifts in consciousness. They will start to really, a marker for somebody that is fully in this flow is that they have moved past their childhood conditioning and childhood pain. They're no longer living out the patterns that were developed in the developmental stages of their life. So again, Kundalini awakenings overall are rare, but for somebody to have this flow in their body are even rarer. And I don't say that to, give anybody some sense of superiority, but to offer perspective and perhaps say if you aren't here yet, um, totally understandable. Um, it is also just helpful to have a map of Kundalini to know that there are phases to Kundalini, and there is an end to the suffering, to the difficulties that people experience. Um, And so the last stage is a stage of light. That flow becomes less and less substantial. It becomes less something where it feels like something working its way through your body, where somebody may be having insomnia because their body is just working all night. It is just trying to get that flow through their body, through their legs, through their head, through wherever energy, through wherever those pipes are not clear yet. Um, and so over time, it does become less and less substantial and less of an impact on daily life. It can get to a point where in that light period where a lot of the phenomena just kind of dies down. There isn't the body movements, there isn't the big shifts of energy, there isn't kind of the trauma and strife and difficulty that there was in the purification and in the flow sort of stages. Um, when somebody is in this light sort of stage, they will experience oneness. There will not only be that lack of superiority, inferiority, but a good test of this is somebody who sees that light not only in the world, but that light in every person that they meet. And what that means is that um, I I can see a part of myself in you. um, Sort of thing. And it sounds cheesy or trite, but it really is true. If what you are coming across is a part of you, that opening of the heart, that recognition of oneness is much easier to experience. It is interesting in this last phase, the light phase, is that a lot of spiritual interests tend to ebb and wane. A lot of spiritual practices aren't needed as much anymore because there isn't this difference between mind, body, and spirit anymore. You know, you are the magic, you are the spirit, you are the consciousness, sort of thing. And so some people try to leap there too early. But what happens in this last stage is very much a simplicity of being, a simplicity of spirit, and a recognition that it is okay to be human and to just go about your daily lives. Don't need to pretend to be a god or the next Buddha or whatever spirituality is trying to sell to you to make that sense of inferiority within you feel okay. That, screaming chasm within is, no longer present. And I'll again bring up that simplicity really comes from working through all the personal stuff, sure, all the conditioning, sure, but at a certain point in this stage and in the later stages of flow, it's about working through belief systems, this versus that, places where we're rigid and could stand to have some softening. So last thing I will talk about, at least for this video, because it's getting long, I could talk probably for 5 years about this subject straight, unfortunately, at this point. That's what comes from experiencing a Kundalini awakening and, working with people for 20 some odd years with it. Is that, let's talk about the trajectories. For simplicity, I will say that ideally Kundalini will awaken through the midline. So it will go through the center of the body and go up, meet the crown. That is the internal trajectory, is basically from perineum to crown. That the whole part of the body has flow. It is a clear flowing pipe and it has light flowing through it. Then we talk about the area past it. So the crown opening, kind of like a whale spout energy going above the crown, and the first chakra, the perineum, opening and flow being felt through the perineum between the legs into the earth. So for those of you who are aware, it's the microcosmic orbit. No, I'm going to talk about that next, but just imagine a straight line going through the body and out of the body, and you will have that thought of that trajectory. There is also the Bindu point, which is kind of back here, where you may see, Jews wearing yarmulkes and, that sort of area of the body, where a lot of the energy in that light period when really energy is pouring into the brain, starts to collect and to go and to gather. And it's really at this point that somebody could consider themselves awake, or, whatever words that they want to put onto it. But energy at that point can really feel dense, or just feel clogged for a long period of time. And it's typically because there's still work to be done in parts of the body before all of the energy can sort of gather here, and kind of be happy in that area. The other trajectories in Chinese medicine are known as the Du and Ren, or in Montauk Chia is the most famous for this, but called the microcosmic orbit. And so that is energy that actually goes around the midline. So starts at the perineum, goes up the spine, goes up the back of the body to the crown, goes back down the front of the body, creating that oval, creating that circuit of energy. And again, this is something that when somebody has typically gone beyond kind of third chakra, they'll start to feel as like a baseline of energy. We'll start to feel that energy cycling through their body. Two other channels to mention are basically the right side of the body and the left. What happens is that ideally Kundalini energy, it will awaken through the midline. For some people, that doesn't happen. For some people, what happens is that fire of the first chakra gets going, but it's kind of like a cauldron with a pot on it. And some of that steam, some of that Kundalini energy, some of that fire starts to go out into the right side of the body. For those of you who want terms, Pingala, right side of the body associated with the masculine or doing polarities of the body. But people who experience this experience the right side of the body opening, this type of awakening where Kundalini kind of gets off its train track and goes in another area, will often have pretty severe symptoms mentally as well as physically. For example, they may be, your cousin who won't stop talking about conspiracy theories and is mentally quite off, or somebody who is just going through an immense amount of suffering. And that is typically because Kundalini has awakened in their first chakra, but can't go anywhere. So it's kind of gone, to the right side of the body. And this channel very much does need to awaken, but ideally it would awaken in concert with the midline, or even after kind of the midline does as part of the Kundalini going to every cell of the body sort of phase, rather than the just starting awakening phase. Some people will have that. This is much more rare. The right-sided awakening is much more prevalent. It is, in fact, the most common form of Kundalini awakening because, well, people think I'm biased, but I will say drugs. There are a lot of drugs, a lot of substances out there that can very much stoke Kundalini energies. And what happens with that is often that picture of top-down awakening where there's a lot of energy in the head, and then there's energy in the first chakra, but it can't go anywhere because the person hasn't basically worked through like kind of their basic childhood wounding sort of stuff. So it becomes that going off the train tracks to the right side sort of energy. But the rarer is the left side, and it is rare because it is associated with the feminine polarity, but it is also rare because right side Kundalini energies typically come from people doing things really fast, really hard, really cathartic. So people who've experienced these types of awakenings, they may be spontaneous, or they may be somebody who has a whole lot of resistance and suffering and kind of that victim complex I'm talking about for very good reason. They may be somebody who, has taken some MDMA or gone to an ayahuasca retreat, and all of a sudden, they are a golden god, and, all of that sort of stuff. And I used to get a lot of people, and sometimes still do, who have gone to extensive meditation retreats or done extensive meditation themselves. And it is really hard to find a proper teacher in this world. And so they've started to experience awakening, but again, they haven't done it in a body-based way. And so they have all this stuff coming up, and they go to their yoga teacher or whomever, and the person just sort of pushes them aside or may not know how to help them because it's too intense for them to deal with. Um, and so the Ida, or left side, is lunar. And when this part of the body awakens, it is typically felt as cold. So people will experience during parts of their Kundalini awakening feeling of shivers and cold. And, this is more the emotional side of the body. So that's a lot of info compressed into a short-ish period of time. The last thing that I will talk about is that a lot of people tend to be a bit misinformed and think about Kundalini as a goddess or divinity that is somehow separate from them. And what happens instead with people who do that, instead of considering it their own consciousness, their own divinity within themselves, opening up and awakening, is first of all, they're missing out on like kind of half the process. And people can get into like this sort of knockout, drag out thought of like that there's this force attacking them, or there's this force, that they are powerless to, that is rising to them. And again, that often has to do more with misunderstanding and sometimes kind of being in that first chakra sort of mindset than anything else. I know that I was there for, the first 5-6 years. I felt like I was battling against Kundalini energies because I just had so much stuff coming up, and it was just, it was rough, definitely. So, but if we are to look at it as a force awakening, our own consciousness awakening within our body, what happens is a couple things. First is that we can learn that we can work with it instead of battling against it. And the second is like understanding that it is not Kundalini that is the problem. It is all the stuff that is in the way. Kundalini just wants to flow. It just wants to bring you to a state of greater awareness. It just wants for you to feel connected to someone or something. And we feel so isolated, so alone, so desolate in the modern world, and that can be quite the battle for people to give up, actually. And so that is the objective of Kundalini, is eventually those states of oneness where we feel connection to everyone and everything. And there's just a lot of stuff in the way of that. And in terms of the goddess thing, I find that it is helpful to conceptually understand that, but I find that a better way of looking at it, so you can consider it to be your own energies, is to consider the polarities of the body. And what I mean by that is that the first chakra, the genitals, are the feminine polarity in the body, which has to do with the body, with our emotions, with our intuition, with kind of the darker aspects of self. And then the head is the masculine polarity. The crown is the masculine polarity. And so the real objective of Kundalini awakening is this feminine polarity rising, this feminine consciousness rising, meeting the masculine consciousness, and them combining, them working together instead of feeling separate, apart. The end result of Kundalini awakening isn't a state of emptiness. It is a state of emptiness and fullness simultaneously. It is not a state of this or that, goddess or god. It is a state of all things empty, full, everything in between. So I've gone on for long enough, and I've already mentioned a couple of these things, but let's talk a little bit about why there's so much misinformation out there. The most common thing is that people these days, they don't consider things like Kundalini awakening to be real things. And so I find that this is the biggest reason that people seek to claim certain specific spiritual things. It doesn't really, in a way, matter to them because it's kind of like a play that they are playing out. It isn't something real. It is something that they are mimicking, something that they are miming in order for them to feel better about themselves. And that may sound harsh when I say it like that, but you can get to a certain perspective where you start to see that a lot of people do not consider anything but material reality to be real, even if they have spiritual interests. And so, what will happen at first is that they will try to mentally understand things, or they will just sort of play them out without having the lived experience. And they may never get to the point of actually having the lived experience. They may just be an actor, a bad actor, or a skillful actor. It just depends. But a lot of people don't believe in anything spiritual, actually, anything spiritual or magical being a part of this reality. And so they can say things like, I have a Kundalini awakening because to them, the idea of somebody truly going through this huge shift of consciousness, this huge shift of mind, body, and spirit, um, just is absurd to them. It's not something that can be considered. The second reason I've already talked about, which is that a lot of people are misinformed. There are a lot of different kinds of spiritual awakening. Kundalini awakening is one of them. And so they may just think of any type of spiritual awakening um, as a Kundalini awakening. And so I've heard people say things like, oh, if you have any spiritual interests, you're having a Kundalini awakening. Okay, arguably you're having some awakening of consciousness. Otherwise, you wouldn't have picked up that spiritual book or that philosophy book or whatever you're reading, that self-help book. But sometimes things can get a lot deeper, a lot, further down the rabbit hole than most people recognize. And without that midline awakening, it isn't a Kundalini awakening. And I'm not saying that to stress the rarity of anything. In my practice, a lot of times it has to do with how is this going to be treated, how to get this person to a state of balance. And people going through Kundalini awakening until they get to the light phase are in a state of imbalance. And so the question is, what sort of support does this person need to, get their pipes cleaned out, so to speak? And the last reason I've talked about as well is that, people feel a bit of energy flow in their body. Maybe they'll feel like a bit of prickly energy or electrical sensations in their body. Or they did their first, magic spell and they got it to work, or, they consider themselves spiritual because they've been doing yoga for a long period of time, or they follow a particular religious or spiritual path that talks about Kundalini. And so they figure, oh, I've been doing this for 10 years. I'm having a Kundalini awakening. Um, and they may be, or they may not be, but there are a lot of people who consider Kundalini awakening to be kind of top of the mountain and that tired old cliched saying. And so they want it. They want it as part of their identity because there is something within themselves that is yearning for spiritual communion, that feels lonely, that feels isolated, that really wants to experience some state of transcendence, which is totally understandable. But that is why there's so much misinformation out there, is that it is easily sellable to people to create a system that says, I will awaken your Kundalini. And there's so much unfortunate um, belief and abuse and, all this sort of stuff that is done in the name of Kundalini because we associate it with something that we can place identity into and that we would want to be associated with because we consider it an advanced spiritual thing and we want to consider ourselves an advanced spiritual being. Without recognizing that if we were, if we were kind of beyond those first three chakras of awareness, if we were experiencing a Kundalini awakening, that there wouldn't be that need anymore. That would have been worked through, basically. So I will end with where people can go from here. I will hopefully, I will likely be doing more videos on this. Some of them a lot shorter, but this is, if you have any specific Kundalini awakening questions, feel free to put them in the comments and I will look at them and see which ones would be good to answer in follow-up videos and all of that. So if you're just interested in spiritual awakenings overall, I suggest my Spiritual Awakening Guide. It's where I suggest most people start. However, if you're particularly having a Kundalini awakening in the modern world, I suggest my book, Working with Kundalini. And if you are looking for a way to work with that Kundalini flow of energy, or that Kundalini purifying fire that is going through your body, what I suggest is my book, The Body Deva. And that is because it works with the body consciousness. It teaches you how to communicate with your body, to question what it is holding, what that boulder is doing there, and get it to let go, so there can be greater flow and less stress, less pressure, less symptoms of whatever you're experiencing. You can also contact me through my website, maryshutan.com. I do offer support groups and all sorts of teachings for people who are going through a lot of this sort of stuff. So I wish all of you well. Thank you to all of those who made this through this video. I hope that it has served you.